Princess Lyra pressed her back against the cold stone wall and tried to make herself smaller. The ancient ruins of Korthik Prime stretched around her like a tomb, filled with shadows and the echo of her own breathing. She could hear the beast. Moving somewhere above, its massive claws scraping against metal and stone as it searched for her. Her diplomatic vessel lay in pieces across the canyon floor. Twisted metal and shattered crystal scattered like broken dreams. The quantum core still glowed with a faint blue light, its energy signature calling to the monster that had destroyed everything she held dear. She had watched her guards die one by one, their plasma rifles useless against the creature's armored hide. Commander Vex had been the first to fall. The Void Serpent had emerged from the planet's depths without warning, its biomechanical form towering above their small escort fleet. Vex had ordered the other ships to retreat while he stayed behind to cover the princess's escape pod. His sacrifice had bought her maybe 10 minutes before the beast tracked her down to the surface. The crash had been brutal. Lyra's pod had slammed into the ruins with enough force to crack her ribs and leave her vision swimming. When she finally crawled free from the wreckage, she found herself alone among the dead stones of a civilization that had vanished centuries ago. The irony was not lost on her that she might join them in death. She touched the medical patches on her side, feeling the synthetic skin working to seal her wounds. The Valdrean healing technology was advanced, but it could only do so much. She had maybe 3 days of supplies left, and that was assuming the beast didn't find her first. The princess closed her eyes and tried to remember her father's teachings about honor and duty. A member of the royal family should face death with dignity, accepting their fate as the will of the universe. But she was only 23 years old, and the thought of dying alone in these ruins filled her with terror that she struggled to hide even from herself. Her mission had been simple enough. The Outer Rim colonies needed more trade agreements, and her diplomatic skills had proven useful in past negotiations. The Valdrean Council had thought this would be a safe assignment, far from the war zones that plagued the inner systems. Number 1 had expected to encounter a void serpent this far from its usual hunting grounds. The creature was ancient, older than most civilizations. It fed on refined energy sources, drawn to the quantum cores and fusion reactors that powered modern starships. Some scholars believed it was a weapon created by a long-dead race, while others thought it was a natural evolution of something that had learned to hunt among the stars. Either way, it was nearly impossible to kill. Lyra had studied the tactical reports during her military training. The serpent's biomechanical nature allowed it to adapt to energy weapons, growing new armor plating to deflect future attacks. Its scales could absorb most projectile weapons, and its size made it nearly impossible to avoid once it locked onto a target. 3 different fleets had tried to destroy it over the past decade, and all had failed. She heard the beast roar somewhere above, a sound that made the ancient stones vibrate around her. It was getting frustrated, she realized. The creature was used to quick kills, not long hunts through cramped ruins. That might be her only advantage, assuming she could stay hidden long enough for help to arrive, but who would come for her? The Valdrean fleet had strict protocols about engaging void serpents. They would not risk more ships and lives for one person, even a princess. The other species in the sector had their own problems and would not waste resources on a rescue mission. With such low chances of success, her people believed in logic above all else. They would calculate the odds, weigh the costs, and make the rational decision to abandon her. She had been taught to accept this since childhood, to understand that the needs of the many outweighed the needs of the few. But knowing something intellectually and accepting it emotionally were 2 different things. The princess pulled out her damaged communicator and stared at its cracked screen. The distress beacon was barely functioning, sending out a weak signal that probably wouldn't reach beyond the planet's atmosphere. Even if someone did pick it up, they would scan the area, detect the void serpent, and turn away. No sane captain would risk their ship and crew for such a hopeless cause. She thought about her younger brother, who would inherit the throne if she died here. He was smart and capable, probably better suited for leadership than she was. The kingdom would survive. Without her, maybe even thrive? The thought should have been comforting, but it only made her feel more alone. The serpent's footsteps grew closer, each impact sending small stones falling from the ceiling above. Lyra pressed herself deeper into the shadows, trying to control her breathing and heartbeat. The creature had enhanced senses, able to detect the slightest movement or sound. She had watched it hunt her guards, tracking them through the ship's corridors like a predator that had evolved for this exact purpose. Her hand moved to the ceremonial blade at her side, a beautiful weapon that had been passed down through generations of her family. It was more art than tool, its crystalline edge designed for ceremony rather than combat. Against the void serpent, it would be about as useful as a sharp stick. The beast's roar echoed through the ruins again, closer this time. Lyra could smell its presence now, a mixture of ozone and decay that made her stomach turn. She had maybe minutes before it found her hiding place, and then her fate would be sealed. She tried to pray to the ancient gods of her people, but the words felt empty in her mind. The old belief spoke of honor and death, of joining the eternal dance of the cosmos when life ended. But she was not ready to dance, not ready to become another casualty in the universe's endless cycle of violence and loss. The princess closed her eyes and waited for the end, trying to find some measure of peace in her final moments. She would die as she had lived, alone among the stars, another forgotten soul in the vast emptiness of space. The beast was coming, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Jake Collins wiped the grease from his hands and stared at the weak signal flickering on his scanner. The distress beacon was barely registering, its pattern indicating a Valdrian diplomatic vessel in severe trouble. He had been working on the Lucky Strike's port engine when the signal first came through, and now he stood in his cramped cockpit trying to decide if he was about to make the stupidest decision of his life. The ship around him creaked and groaned as it drifted through the outer rim of the Corthic system. Most people would call the Lucky Strike a piece of junk, and they would not be wrong. Jake had built her from salvaged parts over the course of 5 years, welding together hull plates from a dozen different vessels and installing systems that had no business working together. She was ugly, loud, and unreliable, but she was his home. Casey's voice crackled through the old speakers with the usual mix of concern and sarcasm that Jake had programmed into his AI companion. The computer had been salvaged from a military transport, its personality matrix damaged but still functional. Jake had spent months repairing the code, and somewhere along the way Casey had developed what could only be called attitude. Jake, I'm reading massive biomechanical signatures from the planet's surface, Casey said, her digital voice carrying a note of warning. Whatever sent that distress signal is sharing real estate with something very large and very dangerous. Jake pulled up the detailed scans on his main display, studying the energy readings with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years avoiding trouble in the galaxy's dark corners. The biosignature was huge, easily the size of a small starship. And it was moving. The quantum signature suggested something that fed on refined energy, which meant it was probably hunting whatever had crashed on the surface. Can you identify the threat? Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Cross-referencing with known species databases, Casey replied. Oh, this is just perfect. It's a void serpent, Jake, class A extinction threat. The kind of monster that entire fleets run away from. Jake had heard the stories about void serpents, though he had never seen one himself. They were living weapons, biomechanical nightmares that could adapt to almost any attack. Smart captains put as much distance as possible between themselves and anything that might attract one. The fact that a diplomatic vessel had encountered one way out here suggested either very bad luck or very bad planning. He looked at the tactical display again, noting the crash site's location among the ancient ruins. Whoever was down there had maybe hours before the serpent found them, assuming they were still alive. The smart thing would be to log the incident with the nearest patrol station and let someone else deal with it. Jake had his own problems, and getting involved in alien politics was a good way to end up dead. The former colonial marine in him kept staring at the distress signal. though he had served 3 tours in the outer colonies before the military, decided that humans were more trouble than they were worth. The official reason for his discharge was failure to adapt to multi-species command structure, but the real reason was that he had punched a Centauri officer who had been using human soldiers as expendable scouts. Jake walked to his weapons locker and pulled out his grandfather's compound bow, running his fingers along the familiar curves of carbon fiber and steel. The weapon was over 50 years old, a relic from Earth's hunting traditions that most aliens would consider laughably primitive. But Jake had learned to shoot with this bow as a child, and it had never failed him when technology let him down. "You're not seriously considering this," Casey said, her voice rising in pitch. "Jake, that thing down there has destroyed entire battle groups. Your bow and arrow routine is not going to impress a void serpent." "Maybe not," Jake replied, checking his supply of explosive arrows. "But nobody expects a human to be stupid enough to try." The truth was that Jake had been living on the fringes of galactic civilization for so long that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to be part of something bigger. Humans were barely tolerated by most species, considered too violent and unpredictable for serious diplomatic contact. They were useful for dangerous jobs that others would not take, but they were not invited to the table when important decisions were made. Jake had made peace with that reality years ago. He salvaged what he could find, traded with whoever would deal with him, and tried to stay out of the way of the galaxy's more civilized races. But the distress signal nagged at him, a reminder that someone was down there facing death alone while he sat safely in his ship. He began plotting a course toward the planet, using the asteroid field to mask his approach. The Lucky Strike was not built for stealth, but she was small enough to avoid most sensors if he was careful. Jake had learned to be very good at being invisible during his years of avoiding Imperial patrols and corporate security fleets. "This is insane," Casey protested. "Even if you somehow manage to reach the surface without being detected, how exactly do you plan to fight something that adapts to energy weapons?" "With something it won't expect," Jake said, loading his gear into the shuttle bay. "Void serpents are designed to counter advanced technology. They've never had to deal with a human using primitive weapons." The plan was simple in concept and probably suicidal in execution. Jake would use the Lucky Strike shuttle to reach the surface, locate the crash survivors, and somehow get them out before the Serpent found them. The details of how he would accomplish this were still working themselves out, but he had learned to trust his instincts over the years. As the ship began its approach to Corthic Prime, Jake thought about the person or people trapped in those ruins. They were probably convinced that no help was coming, that they would die alone among the ancient stones. Most species would have already written them off as casualties. Another tragic loss in the galaxy's endless cycle of violence, but Jake Collins had never been accused of being like most people. He was human, which meant he was too stubborn to accept the impossible and too stupid to know when he was beaten. The Void Serpent might be a legendary killer, but it had never faced a human with a bow and a bad attitude. The Lucky Strike shuddered as she entered the planet's atmosphere, her patched hull groaning under the stress of atmospheric entry. Jake gripped the controls and aimed for the ruins, ready to prove that sometimes the most primitive solution was also the most effective. 1. Jake moved through the ruins like a ghost, his military training taking over as he navigated the narrow passages between ancient stone walls. The shuttle had landed 3 kilometers away, hidden in a canyon where the Void Serpent's sensors would not detect it. Now he was on foot, following the faint energy signature of the crashed diplomatic vessel through corridors that had been carved by alien hands centuries ago. The architecture was beautiful in its own way, with flowing curves and crystalline formations that caught what little light filtered down from above. But Jake was not here for sightseeing. He could hear the beast moving somewhere in the ruins, its massive form creating echoes that bounced off the stone walls like distant thunder. The creature was hunting, and Jake needed to find the survivors before it did. His boots made almost no sound on the smooth stone floor as he descended deeper into the complex. The compound bow felt familiar in his hands, its weight and balance as natural as breathing. He had spent countless hours practicing with this weapon, learning to shoot by instinct rather than sight. It was a skill that had served him well in the colonies where technology could fail but human reflexes remained constant. The crashed vessel came into view as Jake rounded a corner. Its twisted metal frame spread across a wide chamber like the skeleton of some great beast. The quantum core still pulsed with blue light, its energy signature probably visible to every sensor within 100 kilometers. No wonder the Void Serpent had found it so quickly. Jake studied the wreckage with professional interest, noting the scorch marks and claw gouges that told the story of the final battle. The Valdrian guards had made their stand here, using the ship's debris as cover while they tried to protect whoever they were escorting. Their plasma rifles lay scattered among the ruins, their power cells drained and their barrels melted from overheating. A sound from deeper in the ruins caught his attention, so faint that he almost missed it. It was rhythmic like breathing, and it was coming from a passage that led away from the main chamber. Jake followed the sound. Moving carefully through the shadows and keeping his bow ready, the passage opened into a smaller chamber, and there she was. Princess Lyra sat with her back against the wall, her elegant diplomatic robes torn and stained with blood. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, with the pale blue skin and silver hair that marked her as Valdrian nobility. Her eyes were closed, but Jake could see the rise and fall of her chest as she breathed. She was beautiful, even injured and afraid. The Valdrians were known for their grace and intelligence, their mastery of advanced technology and their careful approach to diplomacy. This one looked like she belonged in a palace, not hiding in ancient ruins while a monster hunted her. Jake approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. When he was close enough to touch her, he spoke softly. "Hey there, princess. Looks like you could use some help?" Lyra's eyes snapped open and she scrambled backward against the wall. Her hand went to the ceremonial blade at her side, though Jake could see that she was too weak to use it effectively. She stared at him with a mixture of fear and confusion, her universal translator working to process his words. "What are you?" she whispered, her voice carrying the musical accent of her people. "I'm human," Jake said, keeping his voice calm and non-threatening. "Name's Jake Collins. I picked up your distress signal and came to get you out of here." The princess stared at him with wide eyes, taking in his appearance with obvious disbelief. He was taller than most Valdrians, with dark hair and skin that had been weathered by years of space travel. His clothes were practical rather than elegant, designed for function rather than appearance. The bow in his hands was clearly a primitive weapon, the kind of thing that most civilized species had abandoned centuries ago. "You're here to rescue me?" she asked, her voice filled with doubt. "That's the plan," Jake replied. "Though I have to admit the execution is still a work in progress." Lyra shook her head slowly, her translator struggling with some of his words. "My people's databases classify humans as a pre-contact species. You should not even have space travel, much less be here. Well, we're full of surprises," Jake said. "Can you walk? We need to get moving before our friend upstairs finds us." The princess tried to stand, but her legs gave out and she slumped back against the wall. The medical patches on her side were doing their job, but she had lost a lot of blood and was clearly in pain. Jake could see that she would not be able to move quickly, which complicated his already difficult mission. "The Void Serpent is nearly indestructible," Lyra said, her voice filled with despair. "My guards were the finest warriors in the Valdrian fleet, and they died in minutes. Their weapons were useless against its armor." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "I saw the scorch marks. Energy weapons, right? Plasma rifles, particle beams, that kind of thing?" "Yes," the princess replied. The creature adapted to every attack, growing new armor plating to deflect future strikes. It learned from each encounter, becoming stronger and more resistant. "That's the beauty of advanced technology," Jake said with a grim smile. "It's predictable. The serpent expects energy weapons, because that's what every civilized species uses. It's never had to deal with something like this." He held up his bow and Lyra stared at it with obvious confusion. The weapon was clearly ancient by galactic standards, a relic from humanity's primitive past. The idea that such a simple device could succeed where advanced technology had failed seemed impossible. "You plan to fight that monster with a bow and arrow?" she asked. "Sometimes the old ways are the best ways," Jake replied. "Your guards failed because they played by the rules? I don't." The sound of the void serpent's roar echoed through the ruins, closer than before. Jake could hear its claws scraping against stone as it searched for them, following the quantum core's energy signature like a bloodhound following a scent. "We need to move," he said, helping Lyra to her feet. "Can you show me the layout of this place? I need to know every passage, every chamber, every way in and out." The princess leaned against him for support, her weight surprisingly light in the low gravity. She was scared, and who could blame her? From her perspective, she had been rescued by a primitive alien who planned to fight a legendary monster with a weapon that belonged in a museum, but Jake had faced impossible odds before, and he had learned that sometimes the most effective solution was also the simplest one. The Void Serpent was about to discover that humans had their own way of dealing with problems, and it did not involve following the rules that other species took for granted. Jake spent the next several hours studying the ruins while Princess Lyra watched him with growing confusion. The human moved through the ancient corridors like he was reading a map, examining every passage and chamber with the focused attention of a predator learning its territory. He would stop at certain points, run his hands along the walls, and nod to himself before moving on. "What are you doing?" Lyra finally asked as Jake knelt beside a narrow archway, measuring its height with his hands. "Learning the battlefield," Jake replied without looking up. "Your serpent friend is big, probably 12 meters long and 3 meters wide based on the claw marks I found. That means it can't fit through passages smaller than 4 meters, which gives us about a dozen routes it can't follow." The princess had never thought about the creature's size as a disadvantage. To her, the Void Serpent was simply an unstoppable force of destruction that had torn through her guards like they were children. But Jake seemed to see it differently, as if the beast's massive size was just another factor to be calculated and used against it. "You're planning to hide from it?" she asked. "I'm planning to control where it goes," Jake said, standing and brushing dust from his knees. "Big predators are used to being the hunter, not the hunted. They follow predictable patterns because they've never needed to be clever." He led her to a chamber where the ceiling had partially collapsed, leaving a pile of rubble that blocked one of the exits. Jake studied the debris with professional interest, noting how the stones had fallen and what it would take to bring down more of them. "This is where we make our first stand," he said, pulling explosive charges from his pack. "I'm going to rig this whole section to collapse when the serpent passes through. Won't kill it, but it'll slow it down and maybe make it angry." Lyra watched him work with the charges, her translator struggling with some of the technical terms he used. The devices were clearly primitive by galactic standards, chemical explosives rather than the refined energy weapons her people preferred. But there was something about Jake's confidence that made her think they might actually work. "Why do you want to make it angry?" she asked. "Angry predators make mistakes," Jake replied, carefully placing a charge in a crack between two large stones. "They stop thinking tactically and start thinking emotionally. When this thing gets mad, it'll start taking shortcuts instead of being careful." The human worked with methodical precision, setting charges throughout the ruins according to some plan that only he understood. He would disappear into the passages for hours at a time, returning with reports about the serpent's movement patterns and behavior. Lyra found herself impressed despite her skepticism. "It follows the same route every time," Jake said during one of his briefings. "Starts at the crash site, circles through the main chambers, then goes back to check the quantum core. It's looking for you, but it's not very creative about it." "How do you know all this?" Lyra asked. "I've been watching it," Jake said simply. "Stayed upwind, moved when it moved, learned its habits. It's a hunter, but it's used to easy prey. Your guards probably panicked when they saw it, ran in straight lines, made themselves easy targets." The princess thought about the final battle, remembering how her protectors had fought bravely, but without coordination. They had been elite soldiers, but they had never faced anything like the Void Serpent. Their training had focused on conventional warfare, not fighting biomechanical monsters in ancient ruins. What makes you different? She asked. Jake paused in his work, considering the question. I grew up hunting deer in the mountains back on Earth. You learn to think like your prey, to understand what they're going to do before they do it. Same. Principle applies here, except now I'm hunting something that's been hunting other things. He showed her the tracks he had found, pointing out details that her untrained eye had missed. The serpent favored certain passages, avoided others, and had developed a routine that made it predictable. To Lyra, it was still a terrifying monster, but Jake seemed to see it as just another animal with habits that could be exploited. The key is patience, he explained as he set another charge. Most people see something that's big and scary and they want to run or fight right away. But the best hunters wait for the right moment. Princess Lyra found herself studying Jake as he worked, noting the way he moved with quiet confidence through the ruins. He was unlike any being she had ever met, combining primitive tools with sophisticated tactics in a way that challenged everything she thought she knew about advanced civilization. Your people must be great warriors, she said. Jake laughed. Sound that echoed strangely in the ancient chamber. We're great at killing each other, if that's what you mean. Been doing it for thousands of years, getting better at it all the time. Most species think we're too violent for civilized company. But you came here to save me, Lyra pointed out. Yeah, well, we're also really bad at minding our own business, Jake said with a grin, especially when someone's in trouble. The human finished placing his charges and began working on what he called misdirection devices. These were simple mechanisms designed to create noise and movement in parts of the ruins where they would not be. The serpent would investigate the sounds, wasting time and energy while Jake moved his real plan into position. This is like a chess game, Jake explained as he adjusted a tripwire. The serpent thinks it's the only player, but I'm going to show it that the board is bigger than it realized. Lyra watched him work, beginning to understand that this strange human approached problems in a completely different way than her people did. Where Valdrians would use technology and careful planning, Jake relied on instinct and adaptation. Where her guards had fought with honor and courage, he planned to fight with cunning and deception. Do you really think this will work? She asked. Jake looked up from his work, his expression serious for once. Princess, I've been in a lot of bad situations. And I've learned that there's always a way out if you're willing to think differently than everyone else expects. Your serpent is about to learn that humans don't play by the same rules as the rest of the galaxy. The sound of the creature's roar echoed through the ruins, closer than before. Jake smiled grimly and picked up his bow, checking the string tension. With practiced ease. Time to see if all this preparation was worth it, he said. Stay close and whatever happens, don't try to help me fight. Just stay alive long enough for me to finish this. Jake stepped out from behind the collapsed pillar and let the Void Serpent see him. The creature was even more terrifying up close than he had imagined, its biomechanical body stretching 12 meters from head to tail with armor plating that gleamed like polished metal. Red eyes the size of dinner plates focused on him with predatory intelligence, and Jake could see the scars where plasma fire had bounced harmlessly off its hide. Come on, ugly, Jake said, raising his bow. Let's dance. The serpent roared, a sound that shook dust from the ancient ceiling and made Princess Lyra cover her ears from her hiding place 50 meters away. Jake had positioned her in a chamber that the creature could not reach, with instructions to stay hidden no matter what happened. Now he was alone with the monster, armed with nothing but primitive weapons and a plan that probably would not work. Jake fired his first arrow at the serpent's head, watching the explosive tip detonate against its skull plating without leaving so much as a scratch. The creature barely noticed the impact, but it did notice the human who had dared to attack it. With a snarl of rage, it lunged forward, its massive claws tearing gouges in the stone floor. Jake was already moving, sprinting through the narrow passage he had chosen for the opening move. The serpent followed, its bulk barely fitting through. the archway as it pursued him deeper into the ruins. Behind them, the first tripwire activated, sending a shower of sparks and noise echoing through the corridors. The creature paused, confused by the sudden distraction, and Jake used those precious seconds to put more distance between them. He could hear the beast's claws scraping against stone as it decided whether to investigate the noise or continue the chase. Finally, its predatory instincts won out, and it resumed its pursuit of the human. Jake led the serpent through the maze of passages he had memorized, always staying just far enough ahead to avoid its snapping jaws. The creature was fast for its size, but it was not built for the tight turns and narrow spaces of the ruins. Every time it tried to take a shortcut, Jake would vanish around another corner, forcing it to follow his chosen path. The first explosive charge detonated as the serpent passed beneath a weakened section of ceiling. Tons of ancient stone crashed down, burying the creature's tail section under debris. Jake felt the satisfaction of a successful trap, but his celebration was short-lived. The void serpent simply flexed its powerful muscles and threw off the rubble like it was made of paper. "Tougher than I thought," Jake muttered, firing another arrow at the creature's exposed flank. This one penetrated deeper, drawing a thin line of dark fluid that might have been blood. The serpent hissed in pain and anger, its red eyes blazing. With fury, Jake continued his deadly game of cat and mouse, leading the creature through chamber after chamber while his carefully placed traps activated around them. Explosions echoed through the ruins as sections of wall and ceiling came crashing down, but the serpent seemed to shrug off each attack. Its biomechanical nature was adapting to his tactics, growing thicker armor where his arrows had penetrated. The chase led through the main ceremonial hall, where Jake had rigged his most elaborate trap. As the serpent entered the chamber, tripwires activated ancient mechanisms that brought massive stone blocks swinging down from the ceiling. The creature roared in surprise as one of the blocks clipped its shoulder, but it managed to dodge the worst of the impact. Jake was breathing hard now, his legs burning from the constant running. He had been leading the serpent for nearly an hour, and despite all his preparation, the creature seemed no closer to death. If anything, it was getting angrier and more determined with each failed attack. "Plan B," Jake said to himself, changing direction toward the central chamber where he had prepared his final gambit. The serpent followed, its massive body leaving a trail of destruction through the ancient corridors. Jake's arrows were having minimal effect now, their explosive tips barely scratching the creature's adapted armor. He was down to his last few shots, and the central chamber was still 300 meters away. A miscalculation in the passage ahead nearly cost him his life. The serpent had learned from his tactics, taking a shortcut through a chamber Jake had not expected it to use. Suddenly, the creature was right behind him, its jaws snapping at his heels as he dove through a narrow archway. Jake rolled to his feet and found himself in a dead end. The passage terminated in a small chamber with no other exits, and the void serpent was already forcing its way through the entrance. Its red eyes gleamed with triumph as it realized its prey was trapped. "This is not going according to plan," Jake admitted. Knocking his second-to-last arrow, the serpent's head emerged from the passage, its jaws opening wide enough to swallow a human whole. Jake could smell the creature's breath, a mixture of ozone and decay that made his stomach turn. This was not how he had wanted the fight to end, but sometimes even the best plans went wrong. Jake fired his arrow directly into the creature's open mouth, watching the explosive tip detonate against its throat. The serpent roared in pain and pulled back, giving Jake just enough time to spot a crack in the chamber wall that might lead to another passage. He squeezed through the gap, just as the serpent's head smashed into the wall where he had been standing. The creature was too large to follow, but Jake could hear it tearing at the stone with its claws. Trying to widen the opening, Jake found himself in a maintenance tunnel that ran parallel to the main corridors. He had discovered it during his exploration but had not included it in his original plan. Now it offered him a chance to reach the central chamber ahead of the serpent. He ran through the narrow tunnel, his bow banging against the walls as he raced toward his final trap. Behind him, he could hear the void serpent breaking through the chamber wall, its roars of rage echoing through the ruins. The creature was beyond anger now, driven by a fury that made it careless. Jake emerged from the tunnel into the central chamber, a vast space dominated by a raised platform that had once held some kind of alien artifact. This was where he would make his last stand, with only one arrow left and a plan that depended on perfect timing. The serpent burst into the chamber moments later, its armor scarred but its eyes blazing with predatory hunger. It had chased this insignificant human through the ruins for too long, and now it would finish what it had started. Jake stood on the platform, his bow drawn and his last arrow nocked. The creature approached slowly, savoring the moment of its victory. This was exactly what Jake had been hoping for. Jake held his position on the platform as the void serpent circled him like a predator toying with wounded prey. The creature's red eyes gleamed with satisfaction, knowing that this strange human had finally run out of places to hide. Its massive head swayed back and forth as it studied Jake, perhaps wondering why its prey was no longer running. "You fought well for a primitive," the serpent said, its voice a deep rumble that came from speakers built into its biomechanical throat. "But your simple weapons cannot harm me. I have adapted to your attacks." Jake kept his bow drawn, the string pulled back to full tension. His arms were starting to shake from the strain, but he forced himself to remain steady. Everything depended on the next few seconds, and he could not afford to make a mistake. "Maybe," Jake said, his voice calm despite the fear racing through his veins. "But you made one big error in your calculations." The serpent's head tilted slightly, curious despite itself. "What error?" "You assumed I was trying to kill you with those arrows," Jake replied. "But I wasn't. I was studying you." The creature's eyes narrowed. "Studying me?" "Every time you got hit, you adapted. Grew new armor where the arrows penetrated, changed your behavior to counter my tactics." "Very impressive, really. But here's the thing about adaptation. It only works if you understand what you're adapting to." Jake had been watching the serpent's movements throughout their chase, noting how it favored certain positions and avoided others. The creature was intelligent, but it was also proud. It had survived for centuries by overpowering its enemies, not by outthinking them. "I noticed something interesting about your armor plating," Jake continued, keeping his voice conversational. "You've been growing it thicker and thicker, but you can't cover everything. Physics won't let you." The serpent's head rose higher, its massive bulk coiling as it prepared to strike. "Your words mean nothing. You have one arrow left and then you die." "One arrow," Jake agreed. "But I don't need to penetrate your armor. I just need to put it in the right place." During the chase, Jake had spotted something in the footage that Princess Lyra had shown him. The Valdrian guards had been firing at the serpent's body, trying to punch through its armor with brute force. They had missed the one vulnerable spot that every living creature possessed. No matter how well protected, the gap between the skull plates, it was tiny, barely visible unless you knew what to look for. The serpent's biomechanical nature meant it needed joints and seams in its armor to allow for movement. The head was the most heavily armored part of its body, but even it had weaknesses. Jake had spent the entire chase maneuvering the creature into this position, getting it angry enough to rear up and expose the gap. Now the serpent was doing exactly what he had hoped it would do, lifting its head high in a display of dominance. "You're right about one thing," Jake said, drawing his bowstring back even further. "This is my last arrow. Better make it count." The serpent lunged forward, its massive jaws opening wide enough to swallow Jake whole. But Jake was already moving, diving to the side as the creature's head smashed into the platform where he had been standing. The impact sent cracks running through the ancient stone, but it also did something else. It positioned the serpent's head exactly where Jake needed it to be. Jake rolled to his feet and fired his last arrow in one fluid motion, the explosive tip streaking through the air toward the tiny gap between the creature's skull plates. The serpent saw the arrow coming and tried to twist away, but it was too late. The projectile found its mark, penetrating the gap and detonating inside the creature's brain. The void serpent convulsed, its massive body thrashing as the explosion tore through its neural pathways. The red eyes flickered and dimmed, their predatory. intelligence fading as the creature's biomechanical systems shut down one by one. With a final, shuddering roar, the serpent collapsed to the chamber floor. Jake stood over the fallen creature, his bow still in his hands and his heart pounding with adrenaline. The monster that had terrorized the galaxy for centuries was dead, killed by a human with a primitive weapon and a good understanding of anatomy. "Well, that was closer than I would have liked," Jake said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Princess." Lyra emerged from her hiding place, moving slowly toward the platform where Jake stood. She looked at the dead serpent with a mixture of relief and disbelief, as if she could not quite accept that the nightmare was over. "You did it," she whispered. "You actually did it." "Sometimes the old ways are the best ways," Jake replied, shouldering his bow. "Your people tried to fight it with technology. I fought it with patience and a good eye for weak spots." The princess stared at him with new respect. This human had accomplished something that entire fleets could not do, using nothing but primitive weapons and unconventional tactics. Everything she had been taught about advanced civilization suddenly seemed less important. "My people will want to know how you did this," she said. "The Galactic Council will demand a full report." Jake helped her down from the platform, noting that she was moving better now that the immediate danger had passed. "I'll be happy to share what I learned. Might help the next time someone runs into one of these things." As they made their way through the ruins toward Jake's shuttle, Princess Lyra found herself thinking about the implications of what had just happened. A human, a member of a species that most of the galaxy considered primitive, had succeeded, where advanced civilizations had failed. The ramifications would be enormous. "This changes everything," she said. "The Council will have to reconsider their assessment of humanity, maybe," Jake said. "Or maybe they'll just write it off as a lucky shot. Politicians don't like admitting they were wrong." But Princess Lyra knew better. She had seen firsthand what human ingenuity could accomplish when faced with impossible odds. The galaxy was about to learn that there was more than one way to solve a problem. And sometimes the most primitive approach was also the most effective, the shuttle ride back to Jake's ship was quiet, both of them processing what had happened. By the time they reached the Lucky Strike, word of the serpent's death was already spreading through the sector. Ships that had been hiding in distant systems were beginning to return, drawn by the news that the ancient threat was finally gone. Jake stood in his cargo bay, watching as Princess Lyra's rescue fleet arrived to take her home. The diplomatic implications would take months to sort out, but one thing was certain: humanity had just earned its place at the galactic table, one arrow at a time.